Though most karaoke bars don't have it listed for whatever reason.
You left out the best part.
Oh yeah, the chorus, ready? Yeah. Drupal, 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 Drupal. 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 That's like the most culty version. All right, welcome everybody to the February meetup. Great to see everybody. I finally remembered a mic stand. By remembered meaning I accidentally still had it in my backpack when I was on the podcast. So that works. For anybody who's new, I think we might have one or two new people. First Tuesday of every month, and we cycle around 3 different formats. So we have lightning talks, which will be next month. We have Drupal nights, which is this month with the featured speaker, and then for 2019 we have project nights, where everyone brings their laptops and hacks away on stuff related to Drupal. We had that last month, and it went really well. And that will be in April. And tonight is Drupal night. We have Benji as our speaker, talking about the state of the Migrate API in Drupal 8, sponsored by BioRaf tonight. So Ben, or is anybody who's going to get up and introduce Benji? Or am I doing it? Everybody's going to do it. All right, without any further ado. And we'll probably spend 5 minutes wrestling with the display. But.
All right, this is Benji Fisher.
Thank you, Benji.
So I promise that I have enough slides. The question is how many I'll have to skip. And please interrupt with questions, because they will sort of give you indigestion if you hold on to them until the end. Introduction. The state of the Migrate API is strong. You know, I agreed to do this talk months ago, and I sent in a description and chose a title. I didn't know it was going to be the same night as the State of the Union address. But since it is, thank you for coming. I know you have other forms of entertainment that you could have chosen. So I'm flattered that you...
Yes.
What?
I'd rather listen to you.
I'm flattered. Thank you so much. About me, that's my avatar, which is why I wear the hat, so that people who know me online might recognize me as the guy with the yellow pig avatar. That's why I wear the yellow pig hat, to give them a clue. I'm at Benji Fisher on Drupal.org. I guess I have about a little less than a year before my 10-year Drupalversary comes up. Same on GitHub and now on GitLab. And I didn't sign up for a Twitter account for a while, so I had to settle for inserting my favorite number. So I'm Benji17 Fisher on Twitter. I work for Isovera. We're a small Drupal development shop in Waltham, so just inside Route 128. We do strategy, design, development, training. If you've got some projects to work on, I think we've got room for another project or two this year. So as the regulars know from my lightning talks, I tend to be sort of detail focused, but I'll try to sort of save that part till later in the talk and go over sort of stuff that maybe even a CEO could understand. So migration to Geese Fly North. Oh no, this is the wrong crowd for that. So the real idea of migration, new lamps for old, like Aladdin, right? Except for us, lamp stands for Linux, Apache, MySQL, PHP. So the typical use case is that someone has a website, it's getting kind of old, they decide they need to soup it up. Like, it's not even responsive, so we have to redo it.
Incoming transmission.
sorry.
No problem. So the old site might be Drupal 7, might even be Drupal 6. I think someone brought the Drupal 6 site to my attention earlier today. Could be WordPress or something custom, who knows. And I'm talking about the Migrate API for Drupal 8, so I'll say that the new site, to be applicable for this talk, has to be Drupal 8. And we want to bring over all of the content from the old site to the new site. That's sort of the typical migration. And I'll say a little more about this near the end, but I think it says something about where we are in the industry now, that there's a lot of business about this sort of thing, about migrating old sites to new. 10 years ago, no one had an old site, so we were just building things from scratch. And 10 years from now, maybe we'll have the problem figured out and it won't be such a big deal. At the moment, it's doable. It's a fair amount of work. But there are other use cases for the Migrate API. It doesn't just have to be a site that you're bringing into Drupal 8. You could have an XML feed, an Atom feed, RSS or something, and you want to create articles on your Drupal site based on the feed. I have one site that I maintain on a volunteer basis. They haven't paid me in a year, so now I'm back to being a volunteer. Where all of the content comes from a custom XML feed. And I first built it in Drupal 6, and then I migrated it to Drupal 7, and in the not too distant future, it'll be Drupal 8. So then I have double use case. I'll be migrating data from the old site using the Migrate API, and I'll continue to consume the XML feed, still using the Migrate API. Or maybe a smaller scale site, like another site I maintain is for Boy Scout troop. Once a year we get a bunch of new scouts who register. So maybe I prepare a CSV file with name, Boy Scout ID number, address, phone number, blah, blah, blah. There are actually quite a few columns. So prepare a CSV file, create user accounts on the site using the Migrate API. And we do the same thing with events. There's a troop meeting almost every week, so that's easy to do in a CSV file with a spreadsheet to have the date sequence and common information, and then click a button and boom, we've got events on the site. Some important things about the Migrate API are that it handles a few different use cases. So there's the one-time case where you have an old site, you want to bring it into the new site. There's the continuing use case. You have a feed that you're constantly bringing in new articles from. Incremental, that means you've already migrated most of the content, but now there's some new content. So this is sort of the use case where you're developing the new site, and you've already brought over most of the information from the old site, but they're continuing to add stuff to the old site, so you have to keep bringing that in until the new site goes live. And it supports updates, so maybe your XML feed supports some sort of update function, and you're keeping track of the GUI IDs. So you recognize when an article has been updated, you bring in the new content. So I guess the first use case is one that generates a lot of revenue for agencies like Isovera, but then there are all these other use cases. So just a little bit of history. It's been around for nearly 10 years. The first dev release for Drupal 6 was in 2009. And I guess they liked March because the full release for Drupal 6 was in March 2010. At the same time, the 2.0 release for Drupal 6, and I'm sorry, not the same time. A year later, the 2.0 release was made for both Drupal 6 and Drupal 7. And the credits for these earlier versions go, I think mostly, well, maybe entirely, to Mike Ryan and Moshe Weitzman. They were working for, or maybe they were, a company called Curve, or Serve, C-Y-R-V-E. I was afraid that Moshe was going to show up because there's nothing more fun than talking about a subject when the person who invented it is in the room, but he's not here tonight. And they developed this whole framework for theeconomist.com. So that's a pretty substantial site. I don't know, they had tens of thousands of nodes, except they weren't nodes before because they were migrating from some custom CMS into Drupal. It's worth reading Moshe's blog post about it on Drupal.org. So if you have my slide, you can click on that, and if you can't click on the screen, but I'll have the actual link to it later at the end of the slide deck. But one thing I want to emphasize about the history, besides the fact that it goes back about 10 years, is that from the beginning, because it was designed for this fairly substantial migration of theeconomist.com, there were some very important structural things that they got right, and that Migrate continues to do in the current versions. So one of the important things is that the Migrate API keeps track of the old ID for the content and the new ID. So typically, the new ID will be a node ID. On a multilingual site, it will not just be the node ID, it'll be the node ID and the language code. Sort of compound new ID. So it keeps track of that, and because it keeps track of the relation between the old ID and the new ID, that means you can say, okay, roll back everything that we just migrated. Because it says, okay, I've kept track, this goes to that, this goes to that, this goes to that. So as I delete these, I just mark off that I haven't migrated these other three things. And that means that while you're developing your migrations, you can use an iterative process. You don't have to somehow get it perfect the first time around. Yeah, you get the broad outlines, the basic fields in, and you run the migration, and you look at it, and you say, oh, this has to be changed, and you roll it back, and you run it again, and you say, oh, the date format was different, so I have to fix that, and you roll it back, and you do it again. You keep doing it until you get it right. And another thing that it supports is incremental migration. So that's what I talked about a few minutes ago, that you're developing your new site, you're theming it, and you've already migrated a lot of content from the old site, and you're iterating on that and getting it better and better. And meanwhile, the existing site, people are continuing to add content to it, but that's okay. As they continue to add content to it, you can do incremental migrations and continue bringing over the new content. A lot of the people that I've worked with don't seem to realize this, and they sort of think of it as a one and done thing. They'll keep iterating on it locally, and then when they're getting close to done, they'll say, okay guys, content freeze on the live site. You can't add anything new to it because we are going to do the migration now. But in fact, you don't have to be that restrictive because the API does support an incremental migration. It can bring over just the new stuff. Oh no. There we go. So then, I guess those dates I showed you went through 2011, which was roughly the release date of Drupal 7. It was decided that in Drupal 8 we would have the Migrate API in core, and that has happened. The original goals were this is going to be our upgrade path from both Drupal 6 and Drupal 7. And as a result, you'd be able to take your Drupal 6 or 7 site and set up database credentials and blah, blah through the admin UI. And it would bring over the config, so it'll bring over your field configuration, your views, your date formats, all of your config. It'll bring over your contents, your nodes, your comments, blocks, your taxonomy, and it would handle all sorts of contrib modules. So those were the original goals. And originally we said that this had to be done. This was a beta blocker before Drupal 8.0 could be released because we need an upgrade path before we can come out of beta. Or maybe before we could even go into beta. But real life intervened. It turned out to be complicated. And we are still working on it. Would you believe how many people are old enough to recognize that catchphrase?
I'm old enough.
Do the numbers 86 and 99 mean anything to you?
Oh.
Chaos and control?
Yes, okay. Fair
Okay.
enough. Yes.
So would you believe we got this far? You can do all of that for a simple site. If it's a single language site, you can do your migration through the admin UI, and you'll have a Drupal 8 site that pretty much follows the structure of your Drupal 6 or Drupal 7 site. The rest of all the work I do with it is through custom migrations, but it is a robust tool for doing custom migrations. And I have done XML feeds, and I have done old site to new site, and I have done WordPress. And furthermore, the API in Drupal 8 has kept those important things that I called out from the earlier versions. So it does keep track of IDs, it does support iterations, you can roll back and try again, and it does support incremental migrations. And I guess before I go on to that, maybe I should have had a slide for this. An important difference between the earlier versions for Drupal 6 and Drupal 7 and the Drupal 8 version is that to do a custom migration in Drupal 6 or 7, you were writing custom PHP code. It was object-oriented before the rest of Drupal was. And you'd be extending classes and implementing methods and blah, 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 blah. And in Drupal 8, it's done largely through configuration. So we've got YAML files. And I'll show some snippets later in the talk. And sort of, the trick there is figuring out which plugins do we actually write in PHP and what configuration options do we give them so that they're flexible enough that we can piece them together through configuration to do the migrations we have to do. So the basic structure of migration, this is sort of an overview that's widely understood outside of Drupal. It's called ETL for extract, transform, and load. And because we've been around for 10 years, we have our own vocabulary that corresponds with, but is not the standard terminology. So, so the first step is you extract data from your source, you read your CSV file, or you pull from your database of your existing CMS. Second step is, and in parentheses, I have the terms that the Drupal Migrate API uses. So we have source plugins that read the data for us. Second step, transform, we have process plugins. And that's where you massage the data, you change the date format, you strip nasty blink tags out of your HTML markup and so forth. And then the third step, you load it into your new database. You have a destination plugin. So you're creating nodes, you're creating taxonomy terms, users, whatever you need. So the source, as I've said, could be another Drupal site. Surprisingly, Drupal 8.2.8 migrations aren't really well supported yet, although I've done one of them. Could be another CMS. Could be static files, XML, CSV, SQL dump. Could be feed. And I haven't done any of these things that I list as other, but I've heard people talk about a site running on a FoxPro database, or Yo.
I've heard lots for a long time.
I heard it over the weekend at Drupal Camp, New Jersey. Or yeah, we had them copy all of their existing content into Google Sheets. Okay. Obviously not tens or hundreds of thousands of nodes, but there are some sites where that's the appropriate scale that you can do in Google Sheets. Some people put a whole lot of effort into this step. They write their custom PHP code to massage the data and produce exactly what it is that that Drupal is looking for to plug in so that they can pretty much skip the transform stage. So there's more than one way to do it. That works. I like to put all of my work into the transform phase because I think that is more reusable. And I'll say more about that later. But I am not the only one doing migrations. Other people are doing it successfully. Who am I to say? The transform step, this is where I like to do my work. You can convert data formats, your Unix timestamp into a date string or vice versa. Get rid of the horrible font tags in input markup. You could have a comma-separated string, split it up into a list so that you attach a bunch of taxonomy terms to your node. Or if you want to take your great big HTML blobs that someone created with a WYSIWYG editor and split it up into pieces, you might be using the paragraphs module. You can do that during the transform stage. And again, that's something that I've done. The last step, loading into the destination, basically there are only two things we're creating in Drupal. Either we're creating an entity or we're creating a config item. So config item could be field configuration or a view, a bunch of other things. And I guess I could even say they're really one thing because config is a subclass of entity. They're config entities and content entities. But the content entities are nodes, taxonomy terms, users. And it's a feature, not a bug, that the list is so short. That means that starting in Drupal 7 and improving in Drupal 8, we have a rational architecture. There is a lot of common functionality in the entity system, so that if you can cover those two things, you've covered everything. And since the Migrate API is written for Drupal, it sort of already knows everything it needs to know about creating entities. So, anytime I need some custom code to create things, whether it's an XML feed or someone wants to bulk upload a bunch of PDF documents and create media entities, my go-to is the Migrate API because it knows about creating entities. Let it do what it does well. So here's a little table of theory and practice for the extract, transform, and load module. In theory, the extract stage reads from the old database, and the load step writes to the destination database. And in practice, the transform stage does both. And I'll give some examples of why it might be. I guess I don't actually. So one example of why you might write to the destination is what I talked about on a previous slide. If you're taking your HTML blob and splitting it up into paragraphs, then one way to do it, the way I've done it, maybe not the best way to do it, is that you split it up, you create a paragraph entity, so you're writing to the database, create a bunch of paragraph entities, and then you feed the IDs and the revision IDs, because they're ERRs, you feed just the IDs to the next step of the migrate process and say these are the field values for your paragraphs. But while you're splitting up the HTML into paragraph-sized chunks, you're writing each paragraph to be an entity in the database. A typical migration project will have several migrations, each with its own 3 stages. So one migration might be the article content type. So whatever source I'm using that goes into articles is one migration with a source, process, and destination stages, or extract, transform, and load. Or I might actually split that up into a few different pieces, but let me not get too technical. So on a big migration I did last year, not I alone, but as part of the team, we were migrating the community site for Pega, formerly the Pega Developers Network. We had something like 42 different migrations for that project, so that was a pretty big project. Another site that Isovera worked on was over 100, like 130, 140. So it all depends on how you split it up. So some things are easy, some things are not so easy, and some things are actually hard. And what's easy is migrating all the things. So you have one migration, source, transform, destination for your files. You have another migration for your user roles. You have another for your users, one for your taxonomy, or maybe one for vocabulary. You have one for nodes, or maybe one for content type. So just copying over one thing to another, it takes a little bit of work. You've got to come up with your configuration files for each one, but it's bread and butter. It's pretty easy. The not so easy part is to migrate the relations between things. So roles are attached to users. So you have to migrate that relationship. And the Migrate API supports this, but it's not so easy. Taxonomy terms are attached to nodes. These are the sort of relationships. Entity reference fields. Links and body fields. So you have, anchor, href equals my other page. You have to transform that into a link that will work on the new site. And external links you want to leave alone. That's getting harder. You might have previous next links between your articles. You see why that's hard? Because when I'm migrating article number 17, article number 18 hasn't been migrated yet. So what do I do with that next link? And there are a couple of ways of handling that, but it's not so easy. It's actually hard, and this is based on my experience. I suppose another year from now I'll add to the list. But so far this is my list of things that make it hard. Translations. So make sure you understand the translation structure on the source and on the destination before you start doing your migrations. Revisions. When you list the revisions of a node on Drupal 8, it just does it in order by revision ID. But when you migrate them, you're supposed to migrate the node first and then migrate the revisions. And field collections and paragraphs, especially when people build sites overusing paragraphs to do layout. So you have your row paragraphs that contain your column paragraphs that contain your content paragraphs. These nested structures are hard to reproduce. At the very least, you're going to have to start by migrating the individual content things, and then migrate the column paragraphs, and then migrate the row paragraphs, and then build your node. So I would say if I were estimating a project, I would apply a factor of 2 to the migration piece for each of these things that's present. So if the site had all 3 of these, I would take my basic migration estimate and multiply it by 8. I don't know if the project managers would let me get away with that, but that's how it has to be. Understand the source. This is my mantra for migrations. This is the most important part of doing any migration. I think the word triage is sometimes abused in the Drupal community. It's sometimes used just to mean prioritize. I've taught first aid to Boy Scouts, so I know what triage means. What's the root? Three. So what are the three things? In a first aid situation, when you have multiple casualties, you have the first group. These are the people who are going to die. If I don't treat them, I'll treat them first. The second group, these are the people who aren't going to die. I'll put them until everyone else is dealt with. And the third group are the ones who are going to die whether or not I treat them. And I'm not going to waste my time on those. So sort of a less gut-wrenching version of that migration. There are the things that I have to migrate first because there are tens of thousands of them and there's no way they're going to be done manually. And then there's the second group. Well, there are only a few hundred of these, and if we hire some interns, we could do them manually. But if I finish the ones that have to be done automatically, then I can get to those. And the third group are the ones I send to the bit bucket because who needs them? Well, I mean, there will always be some that you don't need. Who's in charge of deciding which ones you don't need? That's another question. And how you decide is you look at your source. That's my heading, right? Understand your source. You have to audit the site. You have to review everything. You have to do some exploration. I was at one presentation at Drupal Camp, New Jersey over the weekend. He used the term spelunking. So you have to understand your structure. How are your translations structured? How do revisions work? What sort of references do you have? How do you use entity references, taxonomy references? Do you have circular references? What sort of nested data do you have? Are you using paragraphs for layout? What sort of markup do you have? Probably people have pasted from Word and have all sorts of font tags in there and stuff. This is a chance to clean that up. Let's leave it behind. Understand your internal links. Maybe there are some content types where the text is just plain static markup and you can just dump it into the new node. And there are some where you'll actually have to look for links and figure out whether they're internal or external and update the internal ones. What isn't there? I violated my own maxim and didn't understand the source. Someone created a ticket in Jira. It said, migrate the meta tags. He said, oh, we need a patch for the meta tag module and this and that and the other thing. We came up with the migration. And then it got to the testing stage. And I said, let me find some nodes that are using individual meta tags overriding the site defaults. Why did we go through all this work? So if I had followed my own rule and understood the source, I would have looked for that first, and we would have skipped several hours of work. What could possibly go wrong? Why are you getting rid of that old site? Because it has all the stuff that my shiny new site doesn't have. We did something 2 years ago, and then we changed our mind. We used a different structure. We decided to use an entity reference instead of a text field. We replicated structure from the previous migration. This started out in WordPress into Drupal 6 and Drupal 7. We've already migrated it 3 times, and we're still carrying around the WordPress ID for this object. There are undocumented features. You all know what an undocumented feature is, right? What's another word? Yeah, thank you, bug. Not that microphone, bug. There are forgotten experiments. Oh, I tried something and it didn't work out and I never cleaned it up. There are Trojan horses. I've seen stuff stuck into a template somewhere that was obviously from some hacker. I forget where I saw it, whether it was actually part of a migration. But if it's in there, you don't want to bring it over to your new site, do you? Now, if only I could come up with one word that summarized all of these problems that you don't.
Customer? Customer?
Customer? Well, I was just thinking of taking the first letter of each bullet point. It took me longer to prepare this slide than any other slide.
Very nice.
And here's the dumb joke. Oh, someone hacked my slide deck. How did that happen? Well, that's the sort of thing that you don't want to migrate to the new slide deck. I've been talking almost 40 minutes. I still have some time left. So let me talk a little about the fun part. As I said, I think the transformation step, the process plugins, provide the greatest opportunity for code reuse, and that's where I have my fun. So here's a snippet from an actual migration. This is something I've done for Pega. We're migrating from a D7 site. So basically, the only information I need to migrate articles is that the source are D7 nodes of type article. So I have 3 lines saying what the source or the extract stage of my migration is. I have another 3 lines for the destination because I'm creating nodes. And the Migrate API knows everything it needs to know about nodes. So that's it for source and destination for the whole article migration. But the transform step, the process step, here are some simple cases. So the outer key is process because that's what the Drupal Migrate API calls the stage. The language code is always going to be EN. So I use the default value plugin. I have some source key, which I guess I'm ignoring. Oh, no, I'm sorry. I have some source key. And if there is no language on the source, then I'll use the literal string EN for my language code. The title is similar. I say it's all configuration, but this slide proves that I'm cheating because one of the plugins I can use is the callback plugin. And so I can specify any PHP function, such as trim. That's a pretty simple function. I could find nasty, more complicated things, but I take the old title, I strip off any leading or trailing spaces, and then I make that my new title. And then the last 2 are even simpler. If my source plugin has given me exactly what I need, I just map status to status, map created to created. That's a timestamp and a Boolean. So those are simple cases, but already you're beginning to see for single migration, there's one source, there's one destination, but then every single field needs a separate transformation step, some of which are very straightforward, just shove the data in, and some of which are a little more complicated. How do you deal with converting old links to new links? And an important piece of the answer to that is the migration lookup plugin. So again, I said at the beginning, the migration API keeps track of the old and new IDs. And so the migration lookup plugin is something that will take your old ID and tell you what the ID on the new site is for that. So if I've already done the user migration, and now I'm doing the node migration, and every node has an author, then the UID, or the author of the new node, I'm going to take the old user ID, pass it through the migration lookup plugin, and that will give me the corresponding user ID on the new site, and that's what I'll set as the author of my new node. There's a lot packed into that, even though it's only a few lines of configuration. Here's something a little more complicated. So I've called it parent or self. This is some sort of intermediate step that I'm going to use later on. And I'm going to take as my source an array of two things, the parent taxonomy ID and the current taxonomy ID. And the idea is that for whatever reason, if the parent is 0, then I want to take the current term ID. And if the parent is not 0, I want to take the parent ID. So I'd like to pass that to the callback plugin and hit it with array shift. I'm sorry. I forgot to say there should be a step in here to pass it through array filter first. So filter out the empty values. So if parent TID is 0, filter that out. And then do the array shift. Unfortunately, this doesn't work. Stupid technical reason. Maybe one of these days I'll submit a patch so that it does work. Again, I've left off the array filter step. Oh no, I didn't. I put in the array filter step. Did I have the array filter step in the previous one?
Yeah.
I did, yeah. My first step was array filter, yes. So I take the source of those two, I pass it through array filter, and then unfortunately I can't apply array shift because array shift, takes its arguments by reference, which doesn't work. So what does work is that there's a dedicated plugin that makes it work in one step. Instead of the callback plugin, I call the array shift plugin. When I started doing this a year ago, that plugin hadn't been written yet. And this is sort of the art of piecing together the different things. So this is what I came up with before. Do the array filter, then pass it through array values, which will index it by 0, 1, 2, and so on. And now that you know what the indexes are, you can extract the 0th thing. So these chains can get complicated, but that's the fun of the process stage or the transform stage of migrations. And it's really sort of like learning a new language. You know PHP, well, now you have to learn APL, or now you have to learn the Migrate API. These are the building blocks that we've provided for the transform stage. Learn how to piece them together like this. Yeah, how do you deal with the nasty HTML in the body that was put in by people with WYSIWYG editors and pasting from Word? Well, the wrong answer is to parse it using regular expressions. And I heard a lot of people chuckle. You've seen this before. It's a famous Stack Overflow answer. People who run Stack Overflow will tell you it's not a good answer. So by their standards, I'm not going to argue with that. I will say that it's amusing. Application in existence for all time, like Visual Basic, only worse. He comes, do not fight. He comes, his unholy radiance destroying all of you. That's funny. So what's the right way to do it? Well, at the end of that answer on Stack Overflow, he takes a deep breath and he says, have you considered using an XML parser? And the right way to do HTML parsing is with a proper parser. PHP supplies the DOM document class and a bunch of related classes. They're a wrapper for whatever the standard library is, lib, expat, or whatever. So let's go through this one step at a time. So I'm defining what the body field of my new site is going to be. The first step is to take the source, the body, and pass it through the DOM plugin, which creates a DOM document object. Then I've simplified this. I'm pretending I'm only doing one transformation on the DOM. This is actually snipped from a real file where it's a lot more complicated than that. But DOM apply styles is a custom plugin that I've written. And you configure it with an XPath and a style. And an XPath tells you where to look in the DOM for the things you're going to transform. The style is a key into the styles menu that you have in your WYSIWYG editor. So what this is going to do is it's going to replace any H2 in the source with something that looks as if it has been styled with whatever classes get applied by my WYSIWYG editor, which is actually kind of complicated on this site. And you can see that that little screenshot is from my test page. This is a, what did I say? This is a note, new section. This is I was just testing the different styles. But the menu that I've expanded there shows the H2 through H6 tags. So anyway, so I do these DOM transformations, and then I pass it through the DOM plugin in reverse. Instead of method equals import, the method is export, and that transforms it back to a string. So the DOM plugin is something that Marco Villegas and I worked on while we were doing the Pega migration to do exactly this sort of proper parsing on HTML elements. We've submitted an issue to the Migrate Plus module saying, hey, doesn't everyone want to do HTML processing this way? And after not having time to work on it for many months, during the contribution day at Drupal Camp in New Jersey on Sunday, I did some work on it, and I think we're getting close. And it may actually get adopted into the Migrate Plus module, at which point everyone will be able to use it. And once that's in, maybe I'll contribute my DOM apply styles plugin so that people can take markup from whatever source and make it look as if it was styled in the WYSIWYG editor on the current site. So a few pieces of advice. Understand the source. Yes, I've said it before. It bears repeating. That's the most important part of any migration for all the reasons I've given, because it's so crufty. Look for test cases before you develop. Right, I forgot to look for meta tags that had to be migrated. And this is something I learned from Marco. Log a message whenever you skip an item. And that's part of your iteration. So after you've run the migration, you look at the items that were skipped and figure out why they were skipped. And maybe there's a good reason they were skipped. That's OK. Maybe there isn't a good reason, in which case you have something to work on in your next iteration. And there are various reasons. Maybe you're not migrating unpublished content. Maybe something has an empty title, and at least you're logging it so you can go and fix it for the next iteration. Or maybe you're just not migrating this language in the multilingual migration. Develop and test small pieces. Do not say, I'll do a little bit of this content type and a little bit of that content type and a little bit of this paragraph and a little bit of that. Do one migration all the way through and test it and make sure it actually works, and then copy it over and modify it for the next one, rather than copying it over 5 times and then realizing that something has to be fixed 5 times. Right, that's my second bullet point, don't copy untested code. You will make mistakes. Even if it's not inherently complex, there's a lot of it. There's a lot of opportunity for mistake. As I said, the migration with over 100 different pieces, there were mistakes. Plan on having code review and quality assurance and responding to the mistakes that they will find. And just a little bit of speculation, I'll let you know that I have a terrible track record for predicting the future. Yogi Berra was right. Predictions are hard, especially when they're about the future. But there is the beginnings of a feeds migrate module. I've been saying for a while that when feeds module is ready for Drupal 8, it will be a front end to the Migrate API. Some small steps have been taken in that direction. Basically, they've reserved namespace. They're actually having weekly meetings. I haven't looked at it since Badcamp. Maybe they've made some progress since then. But I think this is the right way forward for the feeds module. take the UI of the feeds module and tie it into the back end of the Migrate API. Job security. In June of 2020, that's the target release date for Drupal 9. Towards the end of 2021 is the end of life for Drupal 7 and Drupal 8. So that's a whole lot of Drupal 7 sites that are going to be migrated to Drupal 9 by then. There will be plenty of work for people who can do these custom migrations. Long term, there's job insecurity. I said at the beginning that I think that in 10 years, we'll solve this problem. One thing I learned when I was learning C++, I read the book by Strauss-Strauss, Who Invented the Language. He's a smart guy. I already knew, that the standard way of attacking a large problem is divide and conquer, break it up into 2 smaller problems. And what I learned from Strauss-Strauss, I'm not saying he invented it, just that's where I learned it, is that the hard part of the divide and conquer approach is the interface between the 2 pieces. You break the problem up into 2 pieces, and then you have to define how the answer to one problem feeds in to become the input of the second problem. We have some promising progress in this direction. But the JSON API and GraphQL, these are outside of Drupal. These are emerging standards. I think that 10 years from now, we'll be able to migrate from anything that produces JSON API. And think about Gatsby. You can produce a Gatsby site just by installing the JSON API module on your Drupal site. And then, it's not easy, but you write your GraphQL queries, you figure out everything you want to pull in from the old site. So there's your interface. It's JSON API, it's GraphQL. I'm not predicting that it'll be those same 2 pieces 10 years from now, but there will be something in there. And I think 10 years from now, migrations will not be so hard. So just a summary, there's my outline, the introduction, the big picture, which was the geese, but then also talking about new lamp for old and the other uses like consuming feeds. History, talked about the extract, transform, load model. What's easy, what's not so easy and hard. Say it again, understand the source. I talked about where I had my fun in the transform step. Give a little bit of advice and talked about the future. And because we like being self-referential, there's the summary. I cribbed the migrating geese photo off of Wikimedia, so it has a share-alike license. So there's the actual link to Moshe's blog post on the Economist migration. Whoa, which is where it all started. What did I do here? This site can't be reached. What did I do?
You click on the image.
Oh, right. Now click back. So there's the link to the, and I visited that link. There's a link to that funny Stack Overflow answer. There's the issue that Marco and I introduced for the Migrate Plus module to use DOM document objects in HTML processing. There's the feeds migrate module. The documentation, I think I said several years ago that the Migrate API for Drupal 7 was the best documented module that I knew of for Drupal 7. Some parts of that documentation have not been carried over. Sort of the in-app documentation links aren't there anymore. But still, there's a whole lot of good documentation on Drupal.org. The API documentation is good. And a shameless plug for the 2 blog posts I wrote using the Migrate API to import and add and feed. And that is that. Giles.
Can you use the GUI to generate a
Skeleton?
demo file, or is it all hand 30 fields. Do I have to type the name of every field in?
Yeah, the question is, can the admin UI create a skeleton, or if I have a bunch of content types with a bunch of fields on them, do I have to create each one of those migrations manually? And the answer is basically yes. You can create the same migrations that would be created through the UI and export them as config objects. And then you've got YAML files as starters that you can work on. And then you can make whatever changes you need to them. So you sort of skip the admin UI, but basically use the structure you suggested, where you generate a skeleton for your migration and then start customizing it. And yeah, that's the way we do 42 migrations for Vega. Nick?
Have you found a way to get useful information out of errors? We can always log things you skip, but sometimes when you're writing a migration, you'll get something like 300 migrated, 3 unmigrated. Have you found a way to find out which 3?
So the question is there a way to get useful information out of the error messages? So sort of the default information is what you said, that when you run the migration, it'll say, I migrated 800 and skipped 5, and that's all you know. So one of my pieces of advice was to log information. You have to put in the log messages, and that's part of your job as someone writing the migration. But then the Migrate API stores, it has one table that I've talked about before that stores the correspondence between old IDs and new IDs. It has a second table for each migration that stores messages. And you, as you're designing your migration, have to take the trouble to say, oh, and if I'm going to skip this one, let's log a message saying what the ID is and some information about why I'm skipping it.
So if one just fails and doesn't get skipped, like I'm thinking particularly of a migration I wrote that doesn't have any skip logic, but it still has a few that are missing out of thousands.
So what I found is in the map table, the destination will be null. So if you search for null values in the destination column,
Awesome.
you can see the source. It doesn't tell you any.
Right.
No,
So
that's-
that's what it's
that's
summarizing
helpful.
for the recording.
Oh, that's super helpful.
So there are some things that are not intentionally skipped, but are failed, which is different from skipping. And then how do you get the information? And one answer, as Shane said, is that the same table that records old IDs and new IDs will record old ID and null when an item fails. So the information is there, you just have to pull it out of the database data. And then, of course, when you figure out why it fails, you then add extra logic to look for that, so that in the future it will be skipped rather than failed. Peter?
So one point of clarification, I think you were showing migrate plus migrations, so that's not actually what's in core.
That's right. The question is, what I was showing with configuration are related to Migrate Plus, which is not in core, but is a widely used module for custom migrations. So there's a very technical distinction here. Using the Migrate Plus module, each one of your migrations is a config object, which you can manage using Drupal's config system. Whereas in core, they're just plugins. I think the snippets I showed you were actually from core migrations, because, yeah, these plugins are still defined frequently by YAML files.
Is it rate shift? I don't think rate shift was. Isn't that plus?
This was in the migrations folder of my custom module. It was not in the config folder.
Oh, okay.
So it's a pretty technical question, and the answer is that I think I actually took snippets that were yeah, Marco wrote the migration drivers and such, so yeah.
Okay. Another quick question. I've seen really bad performance with rollbacks. Like, we basically, instead of ever trying to roll back, we just like reinstall and then try to do migration again. Have you experienced that?
Well, it's a rollback.
Yeah. That's a rollback. But like,
Yeah. So you've seen problems with rollbacks, and okay, maybe I oversold it. Maybe I suggested that it just works smoothly. So the core Migrate API supports rollback, and because it's keeping track of old and new IDs. But often you find yourself in a situation where you're using migrate code from a contrib module or custom code, and you haven't taken the trouble to implement the rollback properly. I have been guilty of this. And it's one of those things like automated testing where you have to sort of spend the time to realize that actually you're saving time in the long run. I want to migrate things in this direction. Why should I spend time worrying about the rollback? So yeah, sometimes instead of migrating and rolling back and iterating, maybe it's simpler just to refresh the database and start over rather than roll back, because actually handling the rollback isn't as easy as I made it seem in my first time through.
well, for example, if you're creating all those paragraph entities, it might be hard to find them and roll them back, right?
Yes. I did say when I talked about it, this was when talking about how the transform stage might write to the database. I did admit that maybe I wasn't doing it in the best of all possible ways. And yes, you've picked out the technical reason for why that is, that when I do it that way and don't pay attention to how I'm doing the rollback, I can't roll back.
I've done the same. I'm criticizing.
Nick?
I have one other question. I'm curious if anybody's found a way to get around. When you migrate, if you don't define the ID, every time you run a migration, you get a new ID for like a taxonomy term. So you're migrating a term, if you run a migration, you'll get a different ID each time you run the migration, if you rolled it back. Because when you roll it back, it deletes it, and reruns it, just creates a new entity, right?
Right.
But if you have something like a view that's using that taxonomy term as a filter, how do you, without manually just assigning it, have you found a way to assign that as part of the migration? Because each environment too will have a different ID, so you can't just like run the migration to, okay, it's going to be ID 52.
Okay, so let me summarize the question for the microphone. So say I have a taxonomy migration, and I've done this iterative thing where I've migrated and rolled back and migrated and rolled back. Each time I roll back and migrate, I get new taxonomy IDs for each of my terms. So now suppose that I also have some other configuration like a view that depends on these taxonomy IDs. So how do I deal with the fact that the taxonomy IDs are changing on me? So there are a few ways you could do that. I think sometimes the view will store the UUID instead of just the taxonomy ID. But I think a better general purpose answer is that since the view depends on the taxonomy, you can declare in the Migrate API that the migration that created that view depends on the taxonomy migration.
Oh,
So before you can roll back the taxonomy migration, it forces you to first roll back the migration that created the view, then you roll back the taxonomy migration, then you redo the taxonomy migration, then you redo the view migration.
So if the view is created outside of that, you're basically out of luck.
That's
Yes, if you're simultaneously creating new views that depend on the terms from your migration, I guess you either have to wait until the taxonomy migrations have stabilized before creating your views, or update them, or figure out some way to use the UUID instead of the ID of a taxonomy term, or you can determine the new taxonomy ID. By default, it'll just say, oh, I'm creating a new taxonomy term. I'm going to take the next sequential ID for this database table. You can override that. But then of course you're responsible for making sure that you don't have duplicate IDs in your database. Yes?
An approach to handling potential circular references, like when content type A has a field that can reference some content type B's, which has another field that can reference some content type A's, so you can't do one before the other. Really.
Yeah, how do you deal with circular references? So the simplest case is the previous next links. So Article 17 says the next article is number 18. Article 18 has a previous pointer to Article 17. And you can have more complicated things where this article points to that basic page, which points to this media entity, which points back to the article. So the Migrate API, and again, this is something that it has had since the Drupal 6 days, has a mechanism for creating stub entities. So in the simple case, the previous next links, as it's creating Article 17, it says, oh, here's a link to the next article. And I look it up. Remember I talked about the migration lookup plugin. I don't find it. Oh, okay, I will create a stub article. And it saves that in the migration table, so it keeps track of old and new. And it doesn't populate it doesn't bring over any fields for that. But then as it's working on the next item, the next article, instead of just creating a new node ID, it will realize that it's already created this stub and use that. So that's one way. Another way to do it, and this is another of the many tricks I've learned from Marco, is that you create stubs. So we often create articles without populating the body field. In one migration, we just basically we're allocating a node ID and doing nothing else. And then we have a subsequent migration, and it depends on that first one, in the same sense that I was talking about before, where the view migration depends on the taxonomy migration. That creates the body fields. And now, as we're processing the HTML and looking for internal links on the site, all of our node IDs have already been created. So there's more than one way around that problem. And I kind of like the second way.
You can also just run the migration again.
Yes, you can run the migration again and update things. Especially processing the body fields with proper HTML parsing is kind of slow. So yes, you can run the migration twice and run it in update mode the second time, but that's kind of wasting some time. And if you're migrating tens of thousands of nodes, that can be significant. So yeah, I'm having more complexity. I'm adding another migration to do the body as a separate field. But in exchange for that added complexity, I'm saving time that I'm only processing the body field once. Well, thank you again. I will soon get these slides up some.